Hi, I'm Brad DeRoche. Welcome to this series on guitar fundamentals. The lesson we're in today is number 15, and the topic is advanced scale patterns. In today's lesson, what I would like to do is to cover some of the technical issues or challenges that we have when it comes to scale playing. Now, all scales present certain problems for left hand or right hand or both. And if we really look at it, there's about 7 or 8 problems that almost every scale presents to us that we have to conquer or master. And so let me start out by giving you this laundry list of things to look at and consider when you're learning scales. Once we go through the list, then what I would like to do is to look at 2 octave scale patterns, 3 octave scale patterns, and a series of 7 major scale patterns that allow us to play major scale in any position on the neck. All right, so that'll be the focus of today's lesson. All right, but first, that list of technical challenges that almost every scale presents to us. To begin with, one of the biggest problems is left-hand fingering. Which left-hand fingering are we going to choose? Thankfully, there are quite a few different scale patterns already out there that have been well thought of. We've got the Segovia patterns, the Shearer patterns, and a bunch of others. And there's a lot of good in those scale patterns, and they're done by people who were some of the, in case of Segovia, for instance, one of the greatest concert players ever. And so there's much to learn from that, and we should look at those. I've presented another set of fingerings in the packet that accompanies this lesson, and so you may want to follow those, and that's what I'll be focusing on in the lesson today. In the packet that I sent to you, it's pages 3, 4, and 5, and so the first one looks like this. These are 2 octave scale patterns, and what I do is I use neck grids with little circles indicating the places that you play on the fingerboard. Inside of each circle, there's a number, and that indicates a left-hand finger. So if it's a 1, it's first finger, 2, second finger, and so on. All right, we'll get back to those pages in just a minute. If you don't have those pages and you want a copy of them, you just need to contact me. I'd be more than happy to email it to you. All right, moving on. After the left-hand fingering, which again has been sorted out for most of us by a fairly advanced player, the next problem that many of us encounter in scales are finger extensions and contractions. Now for me, the finger extension, which is moving the fingers apart this way, for the Segovia scales, for instance, there's only 1 finger per fret in every single one of his scales. He never vies away from this, so he always stays with this particular structure. But for me, I found that there are some times where I can get what I think is a better fingering for me by using an extension. So when I use an extension, it's only the extension between 1 and 2. All right, so it's just this finger extension, 1 and 2. I do not do extensions between 2 and 3, the Spock hand, or between 3 and 4. I find those ones to be weak, and yes, they do sometimes happen in particular pieces of music, but it's not something that I practice a lot. I just practice the extension between 1 and 2. So whenever I have an extension in a scale, it's always between 1 and 2. Always. For me. You may choose something different for you, but this comes from a lot of my own practice and experience, so I think I'm going to give you the best solution here is to, when you do extensions, try and keep it between 1 and 2. All right, so that's one of the other problems. Another one is the tracking with the right hand. So for instance, when we're going across the fingerboard here, making sure that we're tracking the right hand with the left hand string. So if I'm on the 6th string, I'm in the position to play well on the 6th string. 5th string, 4th, 3rd, 2nd, 1st, etc. So over here, if you look at this hand, you should notice that my knuckles, if I get the camera in the right spot here, the knuckles right over top of the string that I'm playing. And as I go through up to the higher strings, notice I'm now over the 1st string. Okay, so that's tracking. That's another problem that has to be solved and thought of in almost every scale pattern that we play. One of the other issues is coordinating the left and the right hand. This is actually huge, and it takes quite a long time, I think, to get good at. It works better if you go kind of slow and you're kind of careful, and we can't always do that. At some point we do need to push the velocity up, but starting where you're comfortable is good instead of starting where you're uncomfortable and you're making a lot of errors. What I think is the best way to coordinate the 2 hands is to play with a really legato sound, a very smoothly connected sound. That means for me that my left hand and right hand fingers are landing precisely at the same time. So it should sound something like this. Alright, so I'm trying to make sure my left hand and right hand are timed so that they're hitting precisely the same at precisely the same time. All right, so coordination of left and right hand is a huge problem and it takes sometimes years to work out, but it has to be worked on. One of the other issues comes up in the longer 3-octave scale patterns, and that is shifting. Shifting is a movement from one position to the next. So if I take one of the patterns that I like to use here, a major scale pattern, I'm starting on G here. There's a shift here on this string, for instance, and another up here. So I had 2 shifts on this particular pattern, and when I do those, I want to make sure in all of my shifts, when I'm moving from one position to the next, I actually move as slowly as I possibly can. I know that sounds counterintuitive, but I'm going to move as slowly as possible from one position to the next. I'm going to take up all the time I can to move from here to here. Why do that? Because if I move too fast and I have to slam on the brakes and land and get to the next position early, that just produces a lot of tension in my hands. All right, so I'm trying to do this as easy as, and with as much ease as possible. So when I'm moving, I'm not doing this. See how if I go really fast and I hurry up and get there, I have to slam on the brakes. It produces a lot of tension in my hand. So instead I go really slow. Again, keeping time. I'm not falling out of time. I'm sticking with the metronome, but I'm just moving as slowly as I possibly can within the amount of time I have. All right, so that's with shifting. The other issue that goes along with shifting is the use of a guide finger. So that means to keep a finger on the string when you're shifting from one position to the next. Now, you can't press down with the full force and fret the notes, otherwise you'll get a glissando. You'll hear the slide. Instead, press, relax the finger so you're releasing the sound, but then you keep the finger in touch with the string and you just slide up and down. Now, guide fingers work well on the first 3 strings. They don't work well on the basses because they produce noise. So when I'm playing these scale patterns, I typically use my first finger the most as a guide finger, but when I was doing this G major scale here, there's my guide finger. It stayed right on the string. Can you see? Watch this finger. It stays right on the string. Same thing. I'm going to stay on the string as I move up to this higher position. And then when I go to the lower position, I'm actually doing guide finger again and then play the other notes. So guide finger. The guide finger on the way back down isn't the first one that's being played. That's what gets a little tricky when you're doing it, but hopefully it made sense when I was playing it. The next problem that I encounter with most scales is choosing the right hand fingering that makes sense. Traditionally, people used index middle alternation, and you just kind of practice starting with index one time, starting with middle the next time, and you sort out which one has the least number of bad string crossings in it. You have to work on the bad string crossings, which a bad string crossing is where you're going from one string to the next higher string with sort of the wrong finger. So if I'm going from, say, the 5th string up to the 4th string, it works better if I go from index up to middle. If I reverse it and go from middle up to index, I have this really strange extension here. It doesn't work out so well. That's a bad string crossing. What we try to do with right hand fingering is as much as possible is to avoid those. You can't avoid all of them. So with index and middle, you're going to get quite a few bad string crossings. However, there's also the modern fingering that I talked about in lesson number 14. You should really check that lesson out if you haven't yet, because it really helps to explain how I go about doing scale patterns with right hand fingering. So I think of them in groups. 3-note groups would be AMI. All those would have been AMI. Then on this string, there's 4 notes, and I broke it up into 2 pairs. So MI, MI, AMI, AMI. Then it's a 5-note chunk up here. AMI, MI. Back to 3 notes. That's AMI, AMI, and MI, MI, AMI, AMI. hopefully that makes sense. So that's modern fingering. I talked about it in a previous lesson, in lesson 14. Go check that out if you want more information on that. Okay, so that's one of the other problems. The other thing that comes up is noise, left hand noise. Splats. That comes from not being precise enough in the left hand. That was a previous lesson also. Go back and check that out if you want some more information on that. And then squeaks. Squeaks occur when we shift on a bass string. And the fingerings that I have in these packets, I've taken out almost all of the shifts that occur on the bass strings, which is one of the things I didn't care for with Segovia patterns. So for instance, when Segovia was doing the G major pattern on the way back down, and this descending pattern, he does a shift on the fifth string, which gives it, for me, a lot of times a nasty squeak. So I try to avoid that. And then lastly, the biggest problem most people run into is velocity, how to get faster. Velocity is really about coordination for me. We already have the ability to move our fingers as fast as we're ever going to be able to move them once we reach adulthood. It doesn't really get any faster, but what does get faster or better is coordination. So coordinating the two hands together. How to do that? I would just start out with one string. Start out with little patterns, just 3-note groups, 4-note groups, etc. And when you get really good at one string and kind of fast with that, then you need to go across strings, and that's where some really big problems come in. So when we're going across strings, that involves tracking and all that other stuff. So it becomes really tricky. All right, so that's kind of the list of problems that we have to solve in almost every single scale. So let's take a quick peek at some of these advanced scales. Page 2, these ones, they're 2-octave scale patterns, and basically all they do is they go across in one position. So these are good to start out with. So I showed you the major scale pattern in a previous lesson. So there's that pattern. There's also natural minor, melodic minor, and harmonic minor. And a quick note, the melodic minor patterns ascend and descend differently. They ascend with a raised 6th and 7th tone in them. So for instance, if I'm here, that's the 6th tone. It's higher than it would be in a normal minor scale, a natural minor scale. So it's raised up a half step. So is the 7th scale degree. So on the way up, we have a raised 6 and 7. But on the way back down, scales are typically played with a flatted or lowered 6 and 7. All right, anyway, that means there are 2 patterns for melodic minor scales, so you have to look at those. Then on page 4, there are my 3-octave scale patterns. These ones are my own fingerings. They're different than, I think, most other people's. So that's a major scale pattern. Note the extension. Shift. All right, so you can look through those. And then lastly, on page 5, there are major scale patterns. And on this page, there are 7 patterns. And what I did here is I basically just mapped out all the notes in a major scale. And in this case, it's an F major scale. It's just for example, because it all fit on the fingerboard fairly neatly. And so I found every single note that's in an F major scale on the fingerboard. And then I simply made a pattern that started on each different note of the scale. So if I wanted to start on the first note, the F, the pattern would look like this to get all the notes in that position. And then if I wanted to start on the note G, the second note of the scale, the pattern changes. And it looks like that. And then the third pattern and so on. So anyway, all of these patterns should be worked on a regular basis. They're extremely valuable for moving up and down the fingerboard. And so I would practice those daily. They're maybe the most important thing you can do in scale playing, maybe more important than the 3-octave scales. All right, there's so much we could do talking about these scales, but time is short and you need to go practice. So I'm going to let you do that. So if you have questions, shoot me an email. Otherwise, I'll see you soon. Cheers.